Chain-link fences sing like cheap chimes in the wind. Floodlights bleach the night. And somewhere beneath the Caribbean stars, a steel door exhales, and something exhales back. You're watching whispering narratives where old rules break and older curses bite. If the lock clicks in your memory tonight, you know why. They called it Block E, a letter the paperwork forgot. But the moon remembers every ledger, and it always settles its debts. Stay close, breathe quiet. The howl is already inside. The ferry to the base moves like a coffin on the tide, low and stubborn, its wake wrinkling the moon. I remember the way the Marines stared at the water, as if the ocean might look back. Maybe it did. The Caribbean here is the color of old surgical scrubs, faded, haunted by work done and left unspoken. Guantánamo Bay, Gitmo, the place the world pretends is a rumor until a news camera blinks. They told me to use the back road, the one that skirts the airfield and the chapel and the thrift store. The signs along the chain-link fence are a catechism in metal. Restricted, no recorders, no devices, no names. At the end of the road, a gate waited, and beyond it, a compound walled like a clenched fist on the clipboard. Block E, access, temporary. Temporary has a long memory here. Inside, the cold hits first. Not the air, too humid for that, but a refrigeration of the soul. The fluorescent tubes hum with bureaucratic devotion. The floor gleams like a scalpel. Every door has 3 locks. Every lock has a story. Every story has a body. The guard with the nicotine smile didn't bother to hide the shiver in his hands when he passed me the badge. "Doctor," he said. "Not my name, never my name. You're the behavioral consultant. You'll read the thing and tell us if it's a man in there. There is a shape a sentence can make when it has been rehearsed in a mirror." His words had that shape, the thing. His pupils were too large for the light. He motioned me down a corridor where the cameras blinked, and the corners carried the smell of bleach and pennies. We passed the chaplain's office, door ajar. A tiny painting of St. Francis turned face down on the desk, as if even the gentlest saint had to avert his eyes. At the far end, a bulkhead door, battleship thick, pocked with welds like heeled gunshot. The keypad clacked. The deadbolt rolled back with the lazy menace of a safe. Beyond it they kept their missing letter of the alphabet. Block E was never meant for men. The ceiling was crowded with vents, hoses, conjoined steel. A forest of pipes that hissed and shuddered like a mechanical lung. The cells weren't rows. They were islands. Each concrete cube separated by a moat of bright nothing. Striplit, watched by turrets of glass in one cube. Shadows skated along the walls. A small avalanche of fur caught in the corners like tumbleweeds. Scratches where concrete met the silver in the shackles, as if the walls had grown a hunger. "Staff Sergeant Miles Harrow," the guard recited, as if reading a joke he didn't get. "Recon unit, Honduras op, 6 months missing. Recovered during an interdiction off La Mosquitia. He came back. Different." The word stalled, then thudded onto the floor. A second guard, older, sleep horse, leaned in. "Twice a month the lights dim on their own. We've replaced the grid twice, doesn't matter on those nights. The metal sings, and the dogs we use on perimeter. They refuse this hallway could be a frequency," I offered, scientist in me performing like an understudy. Something in the ventil. A sound threaded the air. Not a growl, not a voice, a dragging exhale. Like a winter wind dragging its coat along a fence. The first guard stiffened. The second made a sign with his hand that belonged to another life. Another grandmother, a village with roads that wander like goats. They looked at me as if I were a superstition they wanted to believe in. Silver clasped the anchor points in the cell, polished, thick, intentionally vulgar. I've seen restraint systems for men, for monsters, for those who imagine themselves both. This was different. Someone had requisitioned a legend and installed it like hardware. The cuffs were stamped with serial numbers like scripture. At the center, a chair welded to the floor, scarred with claw marks the size of a man's envy on full moons. I asked, but my voice made it a confession. "On any moon," the older one said. "Full just makes it honest." We stepped into the observation room, a coffin made of glass, the microphone off, the lights dimmed by policy and by something else. There he was, folded into himself on the floor, more shadow than man. Bare feet, scarred, wrists in silver cuffs that left no bruises, only a kind of ash-gray irritation, as if the skin could not decide whether to hate or worship the metal. His hair had grown wild, not long so much as unruled, canted to strange angles as if magnetized by dreams. His back rose and fell like a slow tide, and then he turned his head. There are eyes that look at you and see what you are. There are eyes that look through you and see what you could be. If you were worse, his were the latter. Grey at first, then reflective. Then cinnabar at the rim, the color you see when you press your eyelids too hard. The blood-lit geometry of the skull. The pupils flexed like camera apertures in a storm. My name, my real name. The one the badge had scrubbed. Arrived in my mouth and refused to exit. "Staff Sergeant Harrow," I said into the mic I had not turned on. He heard me anyway, not the words, the pulse in them. Somewhere. A generator coughed. Somewhere else. The clock lost a second and never bothered to retrieve it. Harrow rolled to a seated position with the leisure of a king waking. Ankles chained, wrists weighted, he moved like an athlete remembering water. The scars along his ribs formed a new syntax each time he breathed, maps of a jungle that had decided to keep him even after he escaped. The older guard whispered, "He won't eat meat that's cooked. Won't drink from plastic. We bring him water in steel. And the whole block smells like rain. He sleeps when the sun is highest. He wakes when the base dogs bark without reason." Harrow tilted his head. In the glass, my reflection tried to look like a doctor. I pressed the talk button. "Do you understand me?" He smiled with a dozen teeth he hadn't earned in any human life. It wasn't cruel. Worse, it was amused. The chair's legs squealed against the bolts as he tested them and decided they were a rumor. He inhaled again, and the air inside the room cooled, then warmed, like the breath of a predator sampling the day. "Doctor," the nicotine guard murmured, "on your report you'll say he's a man, because the paperwork doesn't allow for anything else." I kept my eyes on Harrow. "Paperwork doesn't hold locks," I said. "Metal does and silver," the guard added too quickly, grasping at the folklore like a drowning man grabs at weeds. "It's silver." Harrow blinked slow, then quicker, then not at all. I realized his ears, subtle, yes but real, were listening to the hallway, to the insects in the vents, to the small, terrified hymns our throats sing when we think we're quiet. Then he spoke for the first time, his voice rubbed raw. "A stone in a river storm," he said. The word dropped into the tile and rolled. The older guard's radio crackled. A cyclone warning 2 islands over. The base had its drills, its laminated steps to safety, its duct-taped bravado. But Harrow hadn't been reading memos. He had been listening, outside. Wind fingered the fence like a harp. "Storm," Harrow repeated. And now the word wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. I felt it in my dental work. We ended the session there because the policy said 40 minutes was humane. We ended the session because the lights dimmed in a way electricity cannot. In the corridor, the chaplain had turned St. Francis face up again and was staring at those gentle, painted eyes like a man who'd found a hole in his theology. The guards signed a form they did not read. The sea exhaled and bared its teeth. That night the base dogs refused to be dogs. They hid under water tanks and inside mop closets, their paws covering their ears like children in a thunder photo. The cooks burned the rice. The medic on duty found her hands shaking when there was nothing to hold. And down in Block E, the vents sang an old song the engineers didn't program, and Harrow breathed to its tempo in my quarters. I tried to write the report the chain of command wanted. Assessments. Scales. Diagnoses that pretend the dark can be made into math. I wrote, "Subject exhibits cyclical arousal patterns correlated with lunar phases but not limited to them." I wrote, "Olfactory acuity beyond human baseline." I wrote, "Behavioral control appears inversely proportional to ambient light irregularities." I did not write, "When he looked at me, I heard the pine forests of a country I've never visited." I did not write, "The body can be a bridge. Sometimes something crosses." The storm arrived at 2 in the morning, pruned to a brutal cleverness by the mountains of Hispaniola. It crawled over the water and down our throats, shut one eye of the sky and opened the other. The first substation went with a sigh. The floodlights hiccuped, recovered, then decided to tell the truth. The base sirens found their volume. Everyone ran toward something and away from something else. Block E's internal grid is redundant 3 times. Quadrupled if you include the prayer of the man who designed it. On the monitor, I watched as the lights held, then browned, then held, like a boxer who doesn't know he's losing. The camera in Harrow's cell flickered but did not fail. He was awake. He was smiling in the storm's dialect. I put on my badge, I put on my courage. Both felt counterfeit. The hallway to Block E was crowded with men who trained their whole lives to be unafraid and were now practicing a new art. Pretending. The chaplain stood with them, collar askew, lips moving in a language that predated the Navy. We hit the bulkhead keypad. The bolt thunked back. Hot wind rushed the corridor like gossip. Inside the observation room, the glass wore a skin of condensation. The vents hissed, the silver looked duller, as if the moonlight in the storm had found a way into the alloy and was tugging at its atoms one by one. The older guard gripped the mic. "Harrow, hold position." Harrow did not move, which is not the same as holding. He inhaled the way a priest lifts the chalice. Somewhere one of the cuffs ticked like a cooling engine. The storm leaned on the roof and the roof complained. In the middle distance, the bay threw itself at the breakwater and missed. And tried again, and missed, the persistence of a bad idea. Then, with a simplicity that broke my heart, the power died, not a bang, not a scream. Just the gracious surrender of a system that has done what it could and will now lie down. For a fraction of a second, every light, every screen, every smug hum shut its mouth, in that thin, complete dark. Harrow made a sound that was not a howl. It was a rehearsal of one, a draft, a bloody signature at the bottom of a contract no one had read. The generators caught, the lights staggered back. Every lock in Block E stayed locked except one. We learned later that the surge sent a kiss of current through a relay that hadn't been inspected since the invasion that never happened. We learned later that the redundancies were faithful until they were not. We learned later that the man who signed off on the install had a child who howled in his sleep. Later is where cowards go to pray in the glass. I watched the right wrist shackle of Staff Sergeant Miles Harrow slide a hair's breadth along its track. A hair can be a mile in the right story. He looked at his hand as if it had told a joke. Then he pushed. The bolt inside the cuff moaned. The silver complained. The floor remembered something it had been in another life. Mud. Forest loam, a place where claws make maps. The older guard slammed the emergency clamp. The clamp considered the command and filed it in the wrong drawer. "Back," I said. My voice finding the register of orders I didn't have the right to give. "Back." The chaplain obeyed. The guards obeyed. Harrow did not. Because men obey, and he was translating himself into fluent other. He stood, the chair, bolted to the floor, went with him a few inches, then remembered the marriage and stayed faithful. Harrow rolled his shoulders and a grammar of bones answered. The air in that room grew teeth. A tremor went through the ductwork like laughter overheard. He smiled again, this time with gratitude. I have read all the papers about dissociation, lycanthropy as metaphor. Body as stage for the psyche's unspeakable. I have given lectures about the wolf we carry to chase down our grief. I believe in science the way a monk believes in bells. But there comes a moment when the bell rings and you hear a throat behind it. He wasn't becoming a story, he was refusing one. Harrow bent forward until his forehead kissed the floor, a lover greeting a lover after years of exile. His spine unfolded in a slow, perfect arithmetic the human back cannot do. The cuffs squealed. The silver smoked a ghost smell like thunder burned into coin. His breath ratcheted. The teeth in that smile arranged themselves for war. The storm took a breath. And then the moon, fat with rumors shamed by clouds, stubborn as a saint, found a slit in the weather and looked directly through the steel vents into the room where we kept the alphabet's missing letter. Harrow lifted his face to it. What came up from his throat was older than the island, older than the ships that brought prisons to shores that did not ask for them. It wasn't loud. Volume is a toy for the juvenile. It was total. The howl went into the bolts and into the bolts' fathers. It went into the chapel wood and made it remember the forest. It went into the dogs and told them to pray. It went into the breakers on the bay and asked them to try again and harder on the monitor. A red error window bloomed like a wound on the door. The second lock released with the shame of a traitor in my chest. The small, careful heart I had crafted over a lifetime of clean explanations tore its white coat and stepped. Barefoot into the jungle if you're still here, listener. Stay. The story is about to break its chains. The base alarm had many voices, but this one was new. It howled like a choir of metal, urgent, off-key, like the island itself was warning us. The cage is tired of being a cage. Guards scrambled in their Kevlar skins, rifles lifted like rosaries. The sound of boots tripping over prayers. The storm leaned harder on the roof. Rain, a tattoo of fists against corrugated iron. Block E shuddered. The fluorescent lights hiccuped, flared to white, then dimmed into a nicotine yellow. In the observation room, the monitors stuttered through static frames, skipping like bad memories. Harrow's body bent in geometries that violated biology, every rib articulating as if it had its own tongue. His skin crawled, no metaphor, it moved, stretching across him in ripples, veins glowing faintly under each pulse. The chaplain clutched his crucifix until the chain bit his palm. His lips moved, but the prayer was wrong. Not Latin, not English, something older, Basque, maybe, or the mountain dialects. He whispered the word Perro de Dios, dog of God. His voice cracked like an old church bell in a storm. The guards noticed. They didn't ask. Not now. The first break, the right cuff gave way. It didn't snap, it wept. A thin silver crack opened with a noise like a sobbing hinge. Ash and sparks bled from the metal, the way wood bleeds resin when wounded. Harrow's hand, fingers warped, flexed outward. His nails elongated, blackened, scraped the floor, leaving trenches in the tile. Engage emergency brace. A sergeant barked. They hit the panel. Steel pylons shot from the floor around the cell like crude crucifixes. For a moment, half a moment, he was boxed in again. But the moonlight threaded the vents, silvering his eyes, and the pylons shuddered as if they too remembered the woods. He slammed his freed hand against one. Bone met steel. Steel flinched. The chair bolted to the floor, skittered, squealed, then tore free with a screech that gouged the guard's teeth. Sparks sprayed like angry fireflies. Harrow dragged it with him like a dead saint's relic, chains clattering, cuffs shrieking as the storm outside roared its approval. Black Site Gospel, the intercom crackled alive. Block E breach, containment priority, non-lethal only, repeat, non-lethal. The guards laughed bitterly at that non-lethal. Against this, you might as well spit at a hurricane and tell it to mind its manners. The older guard chambered around anyway. Orders are for paper, I'm here for bone. They trained rifles on the glass. Harrow cocked his head, his lips peeled back. Not a smile this time, an apology. Then he moved. He hit the glass wall with the full inheritance of his curse. The observation room screamed like an organ pipe. The impact spiderwebbed cracks across the bulletproof pane. A frozen lightning strike between us and him. The chaplain dropped to his knees, not in surrender but in recognition. He whispered again, Perro de Dios, Dios nos prueba, God tests us what silver obeys. The second cuff fought harder. It glowed dull red as the silver heated. A chemical tantrum against flesh not meant to hold it. Smoke rose, the smell, burnt coins and blood. Harrow twisted his wrist until the joint popped, until the cuff's edges shrieked against bone. Then it opened, not because it broke, but because it chose to. Silver obeys the moon more than men. Tonight it obeyed the storm's emissary. The guards opened fire. Muzzle flashes strobed the corridor. Bullets hammered the glass, ricocheting like insects off a cathedral window. Harrow didn't flinch. He raised his hands, long fingers curling into claws, and exhaled that dragging wind again. The cracks in the glass lengthened. One more breath and it would shatter. Behind us the alarms died, not because the breach was over, but because the system had stopped trying. The storm swallowed the sirens whole. Only the howl remained, his and the winds singing together. You can't keep the storm in a box. You can only pray it doesn't learn your name. The glass surrendered, not with a cinematic shatter, not with the pretty fall of diamonds, no. It went with a low groan, a skin splitting, a failure that sounded ashamed of itself. Shards hung for a moment in the frame like teeth, then fell inward, and Harrow stepped through. The soldiers opened fire again, rounds hammering his chest. His arms, his throat. He staggered, yes, but the blood was wrong, darker, thicker, steaming as it fell. His body jerked with each impact, but he did not fall. He absorbed it as if every bullet was just another heartbeat added to his collection. The chaplain didn't shoot, he didn't move. He just whispered, steady now, stronger now, Perro de Dios, dog of God. The guards glanced at him like he'd lost his mind, but Harrow paused mid-lunge, his chest heaved. Bullets lodged in him like rosaries of lead. He turned toward the chaplain, and his mouth formed something almost human, a grin, a snarl. Both the jungle lesson they'd found him in La Mosquitia 6 months after he vanished. They'd said, naked, raving, covered in blood, The official reports spoke of trauma, delusion, feral psychosis, but I'd read the side notes, the ones crossed out in thick marker. Villagers called him the white dog of the saber. They left offerings at night, chickens, maize, rum, and when men went missing from the cartel road, they thanked him. The chaplain had read more. He muttered pieces of it between trembling breaths. Los hombres de los dioses perros. An old heresy, long before Rome. Wolves not of the devil but of heaven. Warriors who carried sin on their hides, so the rest of us could live. The irony cut deep. Guantanamo had caged him like a devil, when maybe he was something else. The first true Howl Harrow lifted his head. The stormlight cut him into halves. One human, broken soldier with skin slick from wounds. One beast, shoulders stretching wider than ribs allowed, muscles knotting into new hieroglyphs. His throat swelled, cords rising like ropes under skin. And then it came, the howl, not the practice growl, not the rehearsal he had offered earlier. The true thing. It erupted from him and filled every cavity of the base. Lights died again, not from the storm but from the sound. Concrete trembled as though remembering the limestone beneath. Men dropped their rifles. One collapsed outright, vomiting, ears bleeding. Another fell to his knees and begged forgiveness in a language his grandmother had spoken, but he'd never learned. Me. I couldn't breathe. The howl was oxygen and suffocation at once. My chest expanded with it, ribs aching like they would crack. My eyes watered, not with tears but with some animal memory, as if my blood knew what my brain refused. The chaplain knelt, crucifix pressed to his forehead. Whispering, we caged an angel in wolfskin, the scent of obedience. What froze the room wasn't just sound, it was scent. The air thickened with it, sharp, metallic, electric. A musk that said predator but also guardian. Half the men dropped their rifles not from fear, but from something worse, obedience. Their muscles betrayed them, their spines bowed. Only Silva still protested, the broken cuffs hissed on the floor, smoking in the moon's borrowed light. Harrow's eyes flared yellow-red, not infernal, but like torches held for travelers in the dark. He moved, not toward the guards, not toward freedom, but toward the chaplain. One knee hit the tile, the beast lowering itself, not in submission but in recognition. The chaplain whispered through his tears, Pero de Dios, he was never ours to cage. An angel with fangs doesn't serve man, it judges him. The blackout wasn't sudden, it was complete. One moment, Block E sputtered in the half-light of emergency lamps. The next, darkness closed in like a fist. The storm outside pressed its weight against the island, and the hum of generators gave one last cough before silence devoured everything. Darkness in Gitmo isn't like darkness anywhere else. Here it's political, it's engineered. It's meant to remind men they're forgotten, but this was older primeval. The guards panicked first. Boots scuffed, safeties clicked, shouted orders collided in the dark. Training had no scripture for werewolves. Rifles barked, staccato flashes, brief, sickly yellow blooms revealing Harrow moving in frames, like a stop-motion monster. Here crouched, there standing, then gone. The first kill, Private Morales, was the youngest, barely out of high school. Eyes too big for the helmet, he screamed when something brushed past him in the dark. A blur of heat, a smell of iron and rain. The scream ended in a crunch. When the next muzzle flash revealed him, he wasn't whole anymore, his body folded backward, ribs open like a library of bones. His blood painted the floor in arcs that looked deliberate, ritualistic, as if Harrow was writing something no one alive could read. The others fired wild bullets ricocheting off concrete, sparks hissing like angry serpents. Each flash showed glimpses of him, fur bristling where flesh had been, a jaw no longer human, teeth too many, too sharp. His limbs worked with a dancer's grace, his kills with a butcher's efficiency. The flooded corridors, storm breached the base like an accomplice. Water forced its way down corridors, pooling fast, turning the sterile hallways into canals. The lights overhead flickered, then surrendered, each bulb popping with a hiss. Men waded knee-deep in black water, rifles lifted, radios dead. Harrow's silhouette cut through the rising flood, ripples curling away from him. Every step sending shockwaves through the current. One sergeant, desperate, tried to radio command with a hand crank set. Before he could finish, the wolf's hand, half paw, half fist, smashed down on him. The radio sparked, shorting in the flood. The sergeant convulsed, then went slack, smoke rising from his uniform. The chaplain whispered over and over, "Pero de Dios. Dios nos prueba. Dios nos prueba. Dog of God. God is testing us." The howl that opens doors. Harrow raised his head and howled again. This time the sound wasn't just heard, it moved things. Locks along the hallway groaned, doors shivered on hinges. The base's infrastructure, designed to keep men in cages, seemed to unlock in sympathy. Cells long sealed flicked open. Prisoners screamed, some begging, some laughing hysterically in the dark. The storm carried the echoes. A choir of panic rising under the werewolf's command. The guards broke rank. One bolted, slipping in the water, rifle skittering into the dark. Another shoved past me, eyes white, muttering prayers from 3 religions. Order collapsed, discipline drowned. Harrow moved among them, not just killing, choosing. Some he tore apart. Others he left trembling, whimpering, their faces streaked with tears. Judgment, not slaughter. His howl decided who lived and who bled. The eye of the storm outside, the storm reached its climax. Wind howled in harmony with him, tearing tin from rooftops. Snapping palm trees like matchsticks, lightning struck the bay, turning the water phosphorescent, alive for a breath. Everything stilled. The guards frozen, the chaplain kneeling. Me pressed against the wall with my pen digging crescents into my palm. And in that stillness, Harrow's eyes found mine. Not wolf, not man, something between, something above. He mouthed a word. I couldn't hear it, but I read it on his lips. Run. The cage is broken, the trial begins. The blackout never lifted. The base became a cathedral of storm and screams, lit only by lightning bolts that cut reality into stark, merciless snapshots. Each flash was a judgment. Each shadow was a witness. The prisoners, freed by the howl, spilled from their cells like rats from a drowning ship. Shackles clanged as men staggered into the waterlogged corridors. Eyes wild, voices cracked, some begged for weapons. Others laughed with the lunacy of men too long in cages. But every voice choked off when they saw him. Staff Sergeant Miles Harrow, no, not Harrow anymore. The wolf that wore his memory like a badge. His chest steamed with bullets that refused to kill him. His claws black with blood that wasn't his own. He stood in the middle of the flood, moonlight leaking through broken vents to crown him in silver. The court convenes. The chaplain rose from his knees, crucifix dangling. His voice boomed, not with authority, but with prophecy. Pero de Dios. Dog of God. He was never sent to be caged. He was sent to judge. The guard stared at him as if he'd snapped. But the prisoners, they listened. Lightning revealed their faces, scarred, sunken, broken by years in darkness. Some dropped to their knees, not out of faith in the chaplain, but out of recognition. They knew this wolf, not him, but the idea of him. Old stories whispered across deserts and jungles, of wolves who walked with saints, of beasts who carried the sins of men so villages could live. One prisoner, a tall Afghan with hollow eyes, tore the chain from his ankle and laid it at Harrow's feet like an offering. Another raised both hands in surrender, muttering, "Al-Kalb, Al-Kalb." The heart dog, the court was in session. The judge had arrived. Who lives? Who dies? Harrow's head turned slowly. Eyes glowing with stormlight, he stepped forward, water hissing around his legs. His claws rose. The first prisoner to charge him, desperate, snarling, teeth bared, was bisected in a spray of red across the wall. His halves floated apart like broken testimony, but another prisoner, trembling, clutching the bars of his broken cell, was spared. Harrow sniffed him, pressed a bloody claw against his chest, then moved on. The man collapsed, sobbing in gratitude. It became clear this was no massacre, this was trial. Those who came at him with hatred fell, those who submitted, who recognized the shape of judgment in his howl, lived. The guards tried to interfere. One lunged with a bayonet. Harrow caught him mid-strike, lifted him by the throat. The man's boots kicked, splashing arcs across the water. Harrow's eyes searched him. Then, snap, his neck bent like paper, another gavel stroke in the court of blood. The chaplain's revelation, don't you see? The chaplain cried, voice echoing down the hall. He is no demon, he is the old covenant, the hounds of God. The Inquisition tried to burn them out, but they survived. They always survive. They carry sin so that we may kneel in the light. He pointed to Harrow, trembling with awe. Every curse is a mask, every mask hides a command. And his is this: To judge the guilty, the guards laughed bitterly. One spat in the chaplain's direction. "You call that a saint?" Lightning flared. Harrow's howl answered. The spitter's chest burst open as claws dragged him into the dark. No jury deliberation needed. The flood as witness, the stormwater rose higher. Now waist-deep, bodies bobbing like evidence. Every flash of lightning revealed more carnage. Prisoners clutching each other, guards firing wildly into the black. And through it all, Harrow stood tall, blood and rain soaking his fur. "A living tribunal," the chaplain whispered. Voice breaking, "It isn't punishment. It's purification," and maybe he was right. The wolf spared some, he destroyed others. It wasn't random, it was pattern. A scripture written in torn throats and spared lives. The base was no longer Guantanamo. It was a courtroom, the walls, the jury, the storm, the gavel, and Harrow, the judge. The executioner, the last word. Some prisons hold men, some prisons hold saints in wolfskin tonight. The doors are open. The island itself became a wound. The storm gouged at the shoreline. Waves cracking the breakwater like ribs snapping in a chest. Palms toppled one by one, falling like condemned men. The wind carried the howl across the fences, across the bay, and out to sea. It was no longer a sound contained to Block E. It was a sentence proclaimed to the world. The prison shutters, doors everywhere gave way. Cells in Blocks A through D groaned open. Men stumbled into the flood, blinking, weeping, some laughing mad. Gitmo had been a cage, but tonight it was a hunting ground. Prisoners surged through corridors, guards firing blind. The storm made allies of the guilty, scattering them through the compound. But they weren't the enemy, not tonight. The wolf chose his prey with surgical cruelty. Not the cage, not the broken, but the keepers of cages. The first officer to stand his ground, pistol raised, was ripped apart so quickly his shadow lagged behind his body. The major who ordered the floodlights redirected was dragged screaming into the water, vanishing in a froth of red. His cap floated back like an abandoned crown. The chaplain's stand. The chaplain waded chest-deep through the water, crucifix still in his hand. His voice thundered louder than rifles, louder than the rain. "Pero de Dios, judge them as you must. But leave the meek, leave the meek." And Harrow listened. Somehow, impossibly, he paused mid-slaughter, yellow-red eyes fixed on the trembling priest. His ears twitched, not in irritation but in understanding. The beast bent its head almost a bow. The chaplain cried harder, "Then it's true you're no curse. Your covenant." The wolf moved on, tearing into soldiers, sparing the prisoners who pressed themselves to the walls, who whispered prayers in every tongue of the earth. The escape lightning struck the motor pool. Vehicles hissed and burned, black smoke twisting into the night. The chain-link fences rattled, posts bending inward as if the storm itself wanted them broken. And they broke, one by one. The perimeters failed. First the inner fence, then the electrified line. Prisoners poured through the gaps, scattering into the storm. Carried into the jungle of Cuba, into fishing boats, into the open maw of the night. The guards who survived fled in the opposite direction, toward barracks, toward higher ground, toward radios that no longer spoke. Gitmo's command structure dissolved like paper in the flood. The purge, and still Harrow moved. He was no longer running, he was leading. The storm followed him as if leashed to his breath. Each step through the water churned currents that dragged bodies behind him. Alive and dead alike, he stalked the command building, the administrative heart of the base. The colonel tried to stand at the steps, issuing orders to ghosts. "Hold the line. Hold." The wolf reached him in a single bound. Claws flashed, and the colonel was halved, body folding in the flood like meat in butcher's paper. The howl that followed cracked windows across the base. Men covered their ears, screaming. Dogs outside the wire howled in harmony. Even the storm stilled, as if it had heard its own name spoken. The narrator's realization I stood against the wall, soaked pen still clutched useless in my hand. All my training, all my science, every report I had written, they were ash in this new scripture. Guantánamo Bay was not being destroyed. It was being judged. The cages had been our gospel. The chains, our creed. Tonight they were broken, and something older than the United States, older than empire, older than the church itself, had rendered its verdict. I saw it in Harrow's eyes as he stalked past me. He did not see me as prey, not yet. I had recorded. I had witnessed. That made me useful. A court needs scribes. The chaplain's voice echoed above the storm. "The island is clean." "The island is clean." But I knew it wasn't clean, it was reset. The sins we buried in its cells had been dragged into the flood, and somewhere beyond the fences, the storm carried them back into the world. You can't hold judgment in chains, it will always find the door. Morning came without ceremony. The storm left as suddenly as it had arrived, crawling back over the horizon like a thief with nothing left to steal. The air smelled of salt, blood, and wet concrete. The sky above Guantanamo was scrubbed clean, too clean, as if the night had been an infection burned out of the world. The ruins of a base. The base was wreckage, fences hung in ribbons, towers lay on their sides like fallen idols, and vehicles smoldered in shallow pools of rain. The parade ground was carpeted with debris, helmets, boots, documents ink-blurred by seawater. The flag still flapped above headquarters, but the pole leaned at an angle, ashamed of itself. Bodies floated where corridors had been rivers. Some were soldiers, torn wide, eyes staring. Others were prisoners, spared not by choice but by drowning. Judgment had been selective. But the storm had not. Block E no longer existed. Its bulkhead doors had twisted apart. Concrete walls chewed open by something no engineering manual could explain. The silver restraints were gone, melted into ash that clung to the corners like frost. The survivors, a handful of guards, wandered the wreckage in shock. Rifles hanging useless from their shoulders. Their eyes were hollow, jaws trembling with a question none dared speak. Who would believe them? Who would write the report? The prisoners who escaped had scattered into Cuba, into the sea, into stories by nightfall. Villages across the coast would whisper of strange men walking dripping into their homes, half mad, speaking of a wolf that set them free. The chaplain sat on the chapel steps, crucifix still in his hand. He was smiling through his tears, muttering, he was never the devil, he was the covenant. His voice had cracked into reverence. His hair was white now. It hadn't been the night before. The wolf's departure in Harrow. No one saw him leave. No one heard the final door he broke. Some swore he climbed the cliffs, fur gleaming in dawnlight, vanishing into the jungle where no patrols go. Others said he took to the sea, walking across the surface of the water like some heretical Christ. I know what I saw, or thought I saw, at the break of dawn. A silhouette stood at the edge of the airfield, watching the horizon, wolf shape, but not hunched, upright, proud, a soldier still. The wind carried his howl one last time. It wasn't rage, it wasn't hunger. It was a verdict sealed, and then he was gone. The narrator's reckoning. I was left with my notes, useless as scripture written on sand. How could I explain to the brass, to the politicians, to the world? They wanted a diagnosis, a label, lycanthropy, psychosis, anomaly, but what I had seen wasn't sickness. It wasn't even curse. It was judgment. Guantanamo Bay had been built to house men the world did not want. That night it housed something the world could not contain. The storm had opened the door, and through it walked a wolf who carried heaven's anger in his lungs. Now I write not for them, not for reports that will be buried in archives. I write for you, whoever reads these words, because one truth remains: the cages are broken. The covenant walks free, and if you hear a howl carried on a storm, it is not the devil, it is the dog of God. Subscribe before the next full moon, because when the storm finds you, there will be no doors left to hide behind, and for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.